Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, InaneDragon, and tonight I'm here to continue our look at inspiring philosophy's case for the soul. Last time, we attempted to pull out his hypothesis from two videos, neurology and quantum biology, and in so doing, we went over some philosophical concepts such as the notions of idealism, physicalism, and dualism front and center amongst them. I explained why I don't consider dual-aspect idealism any less problematic than material dualism, which harms his case. Of course, this ruffled a fair few feathers, since idealists of this bent see no such conflict. To them I say, pointing out a flaw in your proposal does not make a straw man. You can claim that the aspects just work together, but that's dodging the question. Especially if you demand dualism proper to explain how the two substances work together. But let me remind you all, I'm not arguing that idealism in all of its forms is necessarily false, or that we cannot have a soul. Victor Strenger and Sean Carroll do a better job making those cases than I ever could, and their books are linked in the description below. What I am arguing, and will defend here, is that inspiring philosophy fails to make his case, that science supports his conclusions, and in this video we begin to dig into his scientific claims and citations, and whether or not they support his hypothesis. Namely, that there is no physically extant brain, only a mind which creates the projection of the brain by being the observer of our quantum waveform. While I'm focusing on his representations of his scientific sources and what they themselves actually say, we're going to hit on a few claims that aren't sourced, but still need to be addressed. When someone misrepresents what we actually know about the world and does so in a manner that overestimates the strength of their own case, we have to call that out. And in that spirit, let's hear what inspiring philosophy has to say.
What is the mind? Of the thousands of pages devoted to this question, no one can explain how consciousness, and the sense of oneself as a mind, can emerge from 3 pounds of gelatinous pudding inside our skull. How is it that an organ, made of basically the same material, of mitochondria-filled cells, as say your liver, is able to generate consciousness, thoughts, and a sense of the mind?
This last little bit is why I had to include a clip that has no citations and no supporting evidence. Am I alone in seeing how dishonest claiming that neurons are essentially the same as liver cells? This is equivalent to saying, how can a computer made of basically the same material, plastic and electronics, as, say, a fish tank water filter, run video games? When you open your argument with such a misrepresentation of anatomy, it really begs the question of how well you have thought this out and whether or not you are a lying SOB. Now, I agree. We don't know precisely how consciousness arises from the brain. We don't know if it does. What we do know is we have a lot to learn about how the human brain and consciousness works, so I'd prefer not to stultify the amazing research being done in the field of neuroscience by abandoning investigation in favor of going, we have souls! However, Matt Kolbe claims that science is on your side here, and that you are going to give us the evidence. It's going to be demonstrated that we should believe that science fails and we need to assert souls. So let's hear it. What do the scientists say?
It was neuroscientist Wilder Penfield who began to discover hints of this decades ago. Applying an electrode to the motor cortex, he could force patients to do several things involuntarily. He could raise arms involuntarily, even vocalize, as well as recall memories. But in his studies, he could not involuntarily force patients to act. In other words, he could not stimulate the will. There is no place in the cerebral cortex where an electrical stimulation will cause a patient to decide. Penfield concluded that there was a causal force missing, which could not be explained from brain chemistry alone. He argued the mind was not in the brain chemistry and cannot be explained by it.
I have a feeling that I'm going to be saying this a lot about the people being quoted. Wilder Penfield was an amazing man who made great contributions to science. In point of fact, his research into epilepsy likely helped with my diagnosis and treatment. In a sense, I may very well owe my life to Wilder Penfield. That being said, Dr. Penfield was relating his opinions and conclusions based on what was known from his active work during the 1940s and 1950s. This is a man who was writing before the widespread use of fMRI and so many other technologies indispensable to modern neuroscience. Further, while it was Dr. Penfield's belief that the mind could not be explained by the brain alone, his conclusions were based on personal incredulity, as seen on page 79 of his own book. In fact, several times he says that if the brain produces the mind, we would not expect the locus of activity to be the cerebral cortex, where his experiments were conducted, but most likely the diencephalon, region of the brain practically out of reach for direct study by the methods of his time. He simply could not believe the brain was enough to explain the mind, despite admitting that there were promising leads to how we might show that the brain produces the mind. As such, not only is inspiring philosophy relying on Dr. Penfield's self-admitted ignorance and incredulity, but is actually quote-mining Dr. Penfield by ignoring the wider context of the remark. I'm sorry, but the mystery of the mind does not support the existence of a soul, as it is one man's admitted prejudiced opinion based on information that is multiple decades out of date. And beyond this, it displays a highly limited idea of the brain. That incredibly complex and integrated system-wide phenomena like consciousness should ultimately have a simplistic, local origin. Inspiring philosophy is looking for a tree we can call the seat of consciousness, while ignoring the possibility we might need to be looking for a forest. Consider new research done by, and I'm going to abuse this name, Tagliazucci et al., which induces unconsciousness using general anesthetics. The changes in brain activity defy such a simple localized explanation and instead suggest that consciousness may be the result of the integration of the brain's activity present during wakefulness. Obviously, there are ethical impediments to intensively researching the human brain. So why are people surprised that after a measly 50 or so years of serious study, we've only gotten to the point of having some good guesses as to what might be going on? Really, instead of begging the question and pointing out areas of ignorance, can you present positive evidence in support of our possession of a soul?
But this is not the only thing missing in brain chemistry. Another problem that has plagued neuroscience is how unified perceptions emerge. For example, different parts of the brain store information about the color of an object, and different parts store information about the shape of an object. Yet there is no place where the brain combines this information into a unified perception. This is called the visual binding problem. Where do brains combine information to form one unified perception, like we subjectively experience in reality?
And again, you make this about the ignorance we currently have about the brain, or, at a minimum, the ignorance you have about what science can tell us about the brain. The answer is, we aren't sure. Is that really such a bad thing to hear? Now, if you'd like to drill down and know what we do know, then I'd recommend a couple of books. Start with The Cognitive Neuroscience of Vision by Martha Farah. Then find a copy of The Primate Visual System by Collins and Cass. These two books go into great detail about what we currently understand about how our eyes and our brains produce a comprehensive visual experience, as well as examining the outstanding questions and even exploring a few possible answers. Both of these books, written by experts in the particular aspects of neuroscience concerning vision, will explain that the most likely answer is that there isn't a single place in the brain that produces a comprehensive field of vision. It's far more likely to be a distributed process that doesn't rely on some location within the brain. So asking the question, where in the brain, is to miss the point. It's a process, not a module. You're looking for a forest, not a tree. There's a certain irony to me recommending that second book, but I'll let inspiring philosophy dig himself a little deeper before I reveal why I'm laughing on the inside.
In 2013, a peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Cognitive Neurodynamics, titled The Neural Binding Problem, demonstrated from various studies that the visual systems of the brain had been completely mapped, and there was no place it could be responsible for unifying perceptions. This is not to say it simply hasn't been found yet. Instead, researchers noted the entire visual system was mapped, and no area could potentially cause subjective experience by unifying perceptions.
He's going to continue with a couple of quotes, but this needs to be addressed first. As I have already stated, neuroscientists do not expect a single location in the brain to be responsible for unifying perception, but for unification to be the result of a distributed process mediated amongst several regions. There is no need for a single location to produce a unified field of vision, and let's not consider this a matter of dueling experts. Because inspiring philosophy is relying on the work of an experienced professional computer scientist. Not a neuroscientist, not a cognitive scientist, not a biologist. That being said, his specialty is neural systems in computing. He's not a complete layman, and his paper should be considered seriously. However, he should not be considered a challenger to the actual neuroscientists. But what does the paper say about brain chemistry and its ability to explain visual binding? That the neural binding problem is insoluble? No, it doesn't say that. While it brings up a number of points, such as that there is no single location which causes binding, the author also points out that because of this, researchers are looking at total brain function, networks of brain modules, and more. In other words, the most that can be said right now is that we have hard evidence to support the notion that we shouldn't be looking for an isolated structure in the brain that binds together information from other parts of the brain. Which is exactly what I've been saying is exactly what we expect. Now, some would call what I'm about to say poisoning the well. I call it disclosing biases, and it's an important enough bias that Dr. Feldman included it in his paper. This review of the research was funded by none other than the Templeton Foundation, the religious organization that tries to force spiritualism and supernatural ideas into mainstream science. And I think you'll find that may have an effect on what we're going to see in the quotes inspiring philosophy minds from the paper.
To quote the study directly, there is now overwhelming biological and behavioral evidence that the brain contains no stable, high-resolution, full-field representation of a visual scene, even though that is what we subjectively experience. The structure of the primate visual system has been mapped in detail, and there is no area that could encode this detailed information. The subjective experience is thus inconsistent with the neural circuitry.
And now I have to take serious issue with the paper itself, starting with the claim that there is overwhelming biological and behavioral evidence that the brain does not contain a stable, high-resolution, full-field representation of a visual scene. If we're going to claim the possession of overwhelming evidence, that's a big deal, and I hope Feldman is going to support it with a lot of sources, an industry-standard textbook, or at least a meta-analysis of the relevant field. However, he supports this extreme claim with a single paper. Okay. Let's take a minute and look at the paper he's citing, since it must be a doozy of an article, or maybe a detailed meta-analysis. Wait a minute. It's a fucking single page? A full 3 paragraphs? Huh. Well, that should make for easy reading. Let's see. Odd. It's not even talking about what the brain does or does not possess. In fact, the article is nothing more than the introduction to a special issue of the journal. It's not a research paper, not a meta-analysis. It sure is fucking a textbook. Before you ask, yes, I checked the other papers published in that same special issue. It's not likely that Feldman meant to reference one of them, or even the issue as a whole, because they don't make the case that he would need them to do either. They're all free online, links in the description, see for yourself. If anything, several of them do the opposite, offering testable hypotheses or explanations of parts of how we can create a stable representation of our vision. As is often the case in this young field of research, the ultimate answer is, we don't know yet, but here's a path towards learning. So the first sentence quoted by Inspiring Philosophy is unsupported and partially countered by the very journal from which he gets his citation. In light of this, we should be a little more suspicious about Feldman's work as a whole. He is either sloppy or disingenuous. I'm not saying he has to be wrong. I'm saying that if you want to claim science supports your position, you should make sure that the sources you are using are able to get basic citations correct, Inspiring Philosophy. What about your second quote? Well, what do you know? The citation is to one of the books that I recommended earlier, The Primate Visual System. And does this book indeed claim that the whole primate visual system has been mapped out in detail? The thing is, I've been through the book at length, and here's what the book says about how well we've mapped the primate visual system. From page 153, this understanding is of only the broad outline of the system, and a continuation of studies focused on identifying visual areas and resolving discrepancies and differences is greatly needed. From page 387, we haven't fully mapped or understood visual feedback connections. I honestly love this book for its honest and forthright and frequent admissions of ignorance. I just chose some of the best examples. Of course, that means we have not mapped the primate visual system completely enough to make a claim like Feldman's. So again, Feldman is lying pretty blatantly. I don't know what the standards for publication are at Cognitive Neurodynamics, but this really should have been caught and corrected prior to publication. Of course, the worst part is, even if both of these sentences were supported by the respective citations, there remains the fact that both Feldman and the primate visual system state that we don't genuinely expect to find a solitary structure that is responsible for producing our perception of vision. So, what conclusions can we draw from your failure to do proper research, Inspiring Philosophy?
With the entire visual system mapped, we can clearly see the brain chemistry cannot give rise to unified subjective experience and cannot explain how our experiences emerge. The core issue of the mind, our subjective experience, cannot be explained by looking at the brain alone. Thus, we cannot conclude the brain gives rise to the mind if it cannot be responsible for subjective experience and unified perceptions.
So you didn't even read your own source. You know, Feldman, who, despite lying for the Templeton Foundation, admitted that all that this rules out is an isolated module in the brain that produces unified perception. A module which, if you read the book Feldman uses as his source, or Feldman, your source, we don't expect to find anyways. I want to give you the benefit of the doubt, Inspiring Philosophy, but it is things like this that get me insulting you and mocking you. I know your fans got after me for calling you a woo peddler last time, but you are actively, quote, mining lies from a paper that doesn't even support your position. You are not just wrong, you're dishonest, you're a charlatan, and you are a fraud. People who take the time to dig at your sources can see this readily if they approach it with even the mildest amount of cynicism. Your only other big claim is that the mind can change the brain. And then you move on to defending your position from the fact that damaging the brain changes the mind. All of this, whether it's the mind changing the brain or damage to the brain changing the mind, is perfectly concordant with naturalism and physicalism. But this is where the overwhelming majority of your sources are focused. The only attempt you made to show that the hypothesis of a mind as a phenomenon of the brain might be falsified depended on two sources which you quote mined badly. And both sources were predisposed to your side. One because he himself is spiritual, and the other because his work was funded by the world's largest organization for mixing science and spirituality. In other words, you bloated your work cited to hide how weak the scientific evidence really is. Next time, I'll be looking at what Inspiring Philosophy has to say about the mind affecting the brain. Not that this is a challenge to naturalism or physicalism, since if the mind is a process in the brain, that process will necessarily alter the brain. We expect it. I'm InaneDragon, and I hope to see you in the comments. If you've enjoyed this inanity, consider subscribing for more of the same. And of course, those of you who don't like material goods should feel free to donate to my Patreon. A hearty thanks to all of my current patrons. Your support helps cover the costs of this little hobby of mine, particularly the alcohol budget. Thank you all, and good night.